10 Roman emperors history tried to erase. The ancient Romans believed in something called damnatio memoriae, which literally translates to condemnation of memory. This was perhaps one of the most brutal punishments imaginable in a society obsessed with legacy and eternal remembrance. When a Roman emperor or important figure fell from grace, the Senate could decree that all traces of their existence be systematically destroyed. Their names were chiseled from monuments, their faces scratched from coins, their statues toppled and smashed to pieces. It was an attempt to murder someone not just physically, but to kill them throughout all of time, to make it as if they had never existed at all. But here's the fascinating thing about trying to erase history. It never quite works the way you want it to. Despite the Romans' best efforts to obliterate certain emperors from the historical record, we still know about them today. Sometimes it's because the erasure was incomplete, sometimes because later historians documented what happened before the destruction was total, and sometimes because the very act of trying to erase someone made them more memorable. These 10 Roman emperors were meant to be forgotten, their names spoken only as curses if spoken at all. Yet here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, still talking about them. Let's start with one of the most notorious examples, an emperor whose very name became synonymous with tyranny and madness. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD, and while he wasn't technically subject to a formal damnatio memoriae, the systematic destruction of his images and the rewriting of his legacy comes pretty close. Nero started his reign as a young, supposedly promising ruler, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. But power corrupted him spectacularly. He murdered his own mother Agrippina, killed his wife Octavia, and kicked his pregnant second wife Poppaea to death. When the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city in 64 AD, rumors immediately spread that Nero had started it himself to clear land for his massive Golden House palace complex. Whether or not Nero actually fiddled while Rome burned, as the legend goes, he certainly used the aftermath to his advantage, and he needed a scapegoat for the angry population. He blamed the Christians, initiating the first major persecution of this new religious group. Christians were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens, crucified and torn apart by wild animals in the arena. This persecution would make Nero one of the most hated figures in Christian tradition for centuries to come. Eventually, military revolts broke out across the empire. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy and he fled Rome. As soldiers closed in to arrest him, Nero committed suicide, allegedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," as his final words. After his death, his successors systematically dismantled his legacy. The Golden House was buried and built over. His portraits were destroyed or reworked to depict other emperors. His name was removed from inscriptions. Yet despite all this, Nero remained infamous rather than forgotten. Moving forward in time, we come to Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. He was the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, following his father Vespasian and brother Titus. Domitian started as a reasonably competent administrator and military leader, but he became increasingly paranoid and autocratic as his reign progressed. He insisted on being addressed as master and god, which offended traditional Roman sensibilities about the relationship between emperor and senate. He launched a reign of terror against senators he suspected of disloyalty, executing or exiling dozens of them on flimsy pretexts. He also persecuted certain religious groups, including Jews and Christians, demanding worship of himself as a deity. Domitian's paranoia ultimately became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In 96 AD, members of his own household, including his wife Domitia, participated in a conspiracy to assassinate him. After his death, the Senate immediately passed a decree of damnatio memoriae against him. His name was erased from public monuments, his statues pulled down, and his coins melted or defaced. Inscriptions were altered to remove any mention of him. The Senate even renamed the months he had named after himself. His memory was to be obliterated. However, the army had generally supported Domitian, and many of his administrative reforms were actually quite effective, so his successors quietly maintained many of his policies while publicly condemning his memory. Once again, the attempt at erasure preserved rather than destroyed his place in history. Then we have Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 AD and represents one of the most dramatic declines in Roman imperial history. He was the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the so-called five good emperors. Marcus Aurelius had broken the tradition of adopting the most qualified successor and instead left the throne to his biological son. This turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. Commodus had no interest in the serious business of governing an empire. Instead, he fancied himself a gladiator and actually fought in the arena, which Romans considered deeply shameful for someone of his status. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles. He commissioned statues of himself as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club. Commodus's erratic behavior and the corruption of his advisors led to chaos in the administration. Finally, in 192 AD, conspirators including his mistress Marcia poisoned him, and when that didn't work fast enough, a wrestler named Narcissus strangled him in his bath. The Senate immediately declared damnatio memoriae. His name was chiseled from inscriptions, his statues destroyed, and all his ridiculous renamings were reversed. The Senate wanted to drag his corpse through the streets and throw it in the Tiber River, but his successor Pertinax prevented this final indignity. Still, Commodus was meant to be forgotten as an embarrassment to Rome. Instead, he became infamous as the mad emperor who thought he was a gladiator, and his story was even adapted into the movie Gladiator, though heavily fictionalized. Now we come to a truly bizarre figure, Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 AD. He became emperor at just 14 years old, elevated to power by his grandmother Julia Maesa through a military coup. Elagabalus was a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, and he brought this foreign cult to Rome with fanatical devotion, even marrying a Vestal virgin in a religious ceremony that shocked Roman sensibilities. But what really scandalized Rome was his complete rejection of traditional gender norms and sexual conventions. Ancient sources describe Elagabalus wearing makeup and wigs, preferring to be called a lady rather than a lord, and allegedly asking physicians if they could give him female anatomy. Some modern scholars have suggested Elagabalus might have been transgender, though we must be careful about applying modern concepts to ancient contexts. Whether due to genuine moral outrage or political calculation, Elagabalus's behavior gave his enemies the ammunition they needed. His grandmother Julia Maesa, seeing that he was becoming unmanageable, switched her support to his cousin Alexander Severus. In 222 AD, when Elagabalus was just 18 years old, the Praetorian Guard murdered him and his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber River. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae. His name was erased, his religious reforms reversed, and his memory condemned. Later Roman historians portrayed him as the epitome of Eastern decadence and corruption, a monster of depravity. Modern historians question how much of this is true and how much is propaganda, but either way, the attempt to erase Elagabalus failed. We still remember this strange, tragic teenager who challenged Roman norms so fundamentally. Caracalla, who ruled from 198 to 217 AD, presents an interesting case. He's actually quite well known today because of the Baths of Caracalla, one of ancient Rome's grandest structures. But after his assassination, there was indeed an attempt to erase his memory. Caracalla earned his nickname from a type of hooded cloak he popularized, but his real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. He started his reign as co-emperor with his brother Geta, but Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's arms, then launched a massive purge of Geta's supporters, killing thousands. He did issue the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, granting Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, but this was probably more about increasing tax revenue than any progressive ideals. Caracalla was a brutal, paranoid ruler who spent much of his time with the army on campaign. He was eventually assassinated in 217 AD by a soldier while urinating on the side of a road. After his death, his successor Macrinus initially tried to condemn his memory, and there were attempts to destroy his images and remove his name from inscriptions. However, this erasure was incomplete and inconsistent. The powerful women of the Severan dynasty, particularly Julia Domna and Julia Misa, worked to preserve some aspects of his memory, and his massive building projects like the baths were too prominent to destroy. So Caracalla occupies a strange middle ground, neither fully erased nor fully remembered as he might have wished. Geta himself, Caracalla's brother and victim, deserves mention as one of the most thoroughly erased emperors. He was co-emperor for less than a year before Caracalla had him killed in December 211 AD. Caracalla then ordered one of the most comprehensive damnatio memoriae campaigns in Roman history. Geta's name was chiseled from inscriptions throughout the empire, creating thousands of visible scars on monuments that ironically drew attention to the erasure itself. His portraits were destroyed or reworked. Anyone who spoke his name could be executed. His supporters were hunted down and killed in a purge that may have claimed 20,000 victims. The erasure was so thorough that we know relatively little about Geta's personality or policies during his brief reign. Yet paradoxically, the very thoroughness of the erasure made it memorable, and the visible damage to inscriptions where his name was removed serves as a permanent reminder of Caracalla's fratricide. Maximinus Thrax, who ruled from 235 to 238 AD, represents the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of chaos and civil war. Maximinus was the first emperor who had never been a senator, rising from common soldier to emperor purely through military prowess. Ancient sources describe him as being over 8 feet tall, though this is probably an exaggeration. He was a capable military commander, but had no understanding of or patience for the political intricacies of governing the empire. He never even visited Rome during his reign, staying with the armies on the northern frontier. His heavy taxation to fund military campaigns made him deeply unpopular with the Senate and the wealthy classes. In 238 AD, a revolt broke out in Africa, and the Senate supported rival emperors against Maximinus. When Maximinus marched on Italy, his own soldiers, frustrated by a long siege, and seeing that the Senate and people opposed him, murdered him and his son. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae against both of them. Their portraits were destroyed, their names erased from official records, and their memories condemned. Because Maximinus had never been part of the senatorial class and had no powerful family to preserve his legacy, the erasure was quite effective. Today, he's one of the lesser-known emperors, remembered mainly as a footnote marking the beginning of Rome's crisis period. Pupienus and Balbinus were joint emperors for just 99 days in 238 AD during the chaotic year of the 6 emperors. The Senate elected them as co-emperors after the deaths of the Gordians in Africa, hoping that 2 emperors could better handle the multiple crises facing Rome. Pupienus was a military man, while Balbinus was more of an administrator. However, they despised each other and spent their brief reign quarreling rather than cooperating. When news came that Maximinus Thrax had been killed by his own troops, there was brief celebration, but the 2 emperors continued their mutual hostility. The Praetorian Guard, angry at being excluded from the imperial selection process, broke into the palace, dragged both emperors out and murdered them. Their naked bodies were left in the street. After their deaths, there were attempts to erase their memory, though these were inconsistent. Some inscriptions and portraits survived, while others were destroyed. Their brief reign and violent end made them embarrassing figures that later historians often glossed over quickly. They represent the chaos and dysfunction of this period, when emperors could rise and fall in months, and the traditional systems of Roman government were breaking down completely. Their erasure was less about moral condemnation and more about the simple fact that they were forgettable failures in a time of crisis. Finally, we come to Carausius and Electus, who ruled a breakaway British Empire from 286 to 296 AD. Carausius was a military commander who had been appointed to clear pirates from the English Channel. When Emperor Maximian accused him of keeping the recovered loot for himself and ordered his execution, Carausius instead declared himself emperor in Britain and northern Gaul. He ruled his breakaway empire for 7 years, issuing his own coins and maintaining his own administration. The central Roman government was too busy with other threats to reconquer Britain immediately. Eventually, Carausius was assassinated by his finance minister Electus, who ruled for another 3 years before being defeated by a Roman invasion force in 296 AD. After the reconquest of Britain, the central government tried to erase all memory of the usurper emperors. Their coins were recalled and melted down, their inscriptions destroyed, and their names removed from official records. For a long time, Carausius and Electus were obscure figures, known mainly to specialists. However, the discovery of numerous coins and archaeological evidence in Britain has brought their story back to light. They represent an interesting case of regional breakaway during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire temporarily fragmented into multiple competing states. Their attempted erasure was fairly successful for centuries, but modern archaeology has recovered their memory. What's fascinating about all these cases is that damnatio memoriae never quite worked as intended. The Romans believed that memory and legacy were everything, that to be remembered was a kind of immortality. So destroying someone's memory was the ultimate punishment, worse than death itself. But the act of destruction left its own traces. The holes in inscriptions where names were chiseled out, the defaced coins, the suspicious gaps in official records, all of these drew attention to what was missing. Later historians, even those who condemned these emperors, still wrote about them, preserving their stories even while claiming they deserved to be forgotten. The Christians, in particular, kept memories of persecutors like Nero and Domitian alive as villains in their narrative. There's also something deeply human about our fascination with the forbidden and the erased. We want to know what we're not supposed to know, to remember what we're told to forget. The emperors who were meant to be erased often become more interesting because of the erasure itself. We wonder what they were really like, how much of what we know is true, and how much is propaganda from their enemies. We try to read between the lines of hostile sources to find the human being beneath the monster. Moreover, the practice of damnatio memoriae reveals the limits of authoritarian power. The Roman emperors were among the most powerful individuals in human history, commanding vast armies and ruling millions of people. Yet even they couldn't control memory and history completely. Information escaped, stories survived, physical evidence remained. The Senate could order names chiseled from stone, but they couldn't reach into people's minds and erase their memories. They couldn't destroy every coin, every inscription, every reference. And later generations, for their own purposes, would resurrect these condemned memories. The condemned emperors also served a useful purpose for later rulers. They were examples of what not to do, cautionary tales about the dangers of tyranny, madness, or incompetence. By keeping their memories alive in a negative form, Roman society could reinforce its values and norms. This is why the most detailed accounts of condemned emperors often come from historians writing under later, supposedly better emperors. The bad emperors made the good emperors look better by comparison. In our own time, we continue to grapple with questions of historical memory and erasure. We debate what monuments should stand and which should fall, whose names should be honored, and whose should be removed from public buildings. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae seems both alien and familiar. We understand the impulse to condemn those who have done terrible things, to remove their symbols from places of honor. Yet we also recognize that erasing history can be dangerous, that we need to remember the bad along with the good, that forgetting the past makes us more likely to repeat it. These 10 emperors and others like them were meant to be forgotten. The Roman state mobilized its considerable resources to wipe them from history, to make it as if they had never existed. But here we are, nearly 2,000 years later still telling their stories. In a way, they achieved a kind of immortality after all, though not the kind they would have wanted. They're remembered not as great leaders or benefactors, but as cautionary tales, as examples of how power can corrupt, as reminders that even the mighty can fall. Their attempted erasure became part of their story, making them more rather than less memorable. History tried to erase them, but history also preserved them, because we need to remember both the best and the worst of the past to understand who we are and where we came from. The emperors Rome tried to forget became impossible to forget, their names and deeds surviving as eternal warnings carved not just in stone, but in the collective memory of civilization itself. Follow for the next video, 33 historical figures who lied about their entire lives.